Morning being Father's Day, and happy Father's Day to all the fathers that are out there. Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to share a message to encourage fathers, and actually going to start with just a little something that happened to me in a grocery store not too long ago. I do the shopping in my family. I don't know what kind of guy that makes me. Some people say that's kind of bad, and some people say, oh, that's really cool. Usually it's the women are like, man, that's really cool. But I'm shopping for groceries at the grocery store, and I hear this little girl throwing this temper tantrum like 2 aisles away. And apparently she wanted something really bad and was trying to wear her mother down until she got it. And I really didn't understand why the mom was allowing this to go on, why she was allowing it to continue, but she did, and it was to the point where we were kind of working towards one another, and I was dreading that moment when we were going to be in the aisle at the same time. Have you ever had that experience? And so I round the corner, and I see that not only is there an out-of-control little girl actually getting everything that she wants and crying for more, but there are two out-of-control little preschool boys running around randomly grabbing items off the shelf and throwing them into the grocery cart. In fact, I almost ran over one of the little boys because he wasn't even looking. He just ran right in front of me. I had to stop. And so he stops, and he looks back up at me, and he makes eye contact, and then he gives me this malicious little grin, this knowing grin, and grabs some herbal tea, which was right in front of him, and just runs off. This other customer, this other lady is there, and she gives me this exasperated look as she just quickly navigates through the whole thing as fast as she could. And this poor mom looked completely defeated, because not only is she there trying to reason with this little girl who obviously cannot be reasoned with, and pulling stuff out of the cart and putting it back on the shelf, but she can't really do what she came there to do, which was shop. And you could tell by the look on her face that she was extremely embarrassed. She knew that this was a problem, but there was also this look of complete and total resignation. And I thought about her for a few hours after that. I just couldn't get it off my mind, and I just really felt sorry for this poor woman. And every once in a while, you run into children like that. Children who intentionally misbehave to get attention. Children who are selfish and don't understand restraint. Children who are mean-spirited and may not play well with others. Children who don't listen and ignore the rules. Children who are disrespectful and demeaning towards their parents. Children who are just out of control and do whatever they want. And nobody wants to be around children like that. Nobody wants to have children like that. We all want our children to be happy, healthy, well-adjusted, well-behaved. And it's not as simple as saying, well, it's just bad parents that have bad kids or have troubled kids or kids who struggle. Because sometimes some very godly, very nice people can have children who struggle. But still, I think parenting plays a huge role. And certainly, I think the most significant role, especially when the children are younger. And of course, as they get older, there's so many other influences. And just because you're a good parent is not a guarantee that your kids are not going to make decisions that disappoint you or decisions that cause them to pay various consequences down the road and cause them to struggle and have problems in their lives. But there are certain things that you can do as parents that almost virtually guarantee those things. And the Bible talks about that. In fact, David is a wonderful illustration of how to raise troubled kids. Or you can say he's a terrible example as the father. But there are certain things that we see in his life, certain patterns that we see that I think are important for us to understand as parents, as we have some potential parents sitting over here, hopefully down the road, and grandparents. I mean, all of us, this is an issue that impacts all of us, and principles, I think, that can be very significant for all of us if we want to raise our children right, and we want to raise children that love the Lord and have, good things happen in their lives and not give them struggles and issues or encourage those things in their lives. And so if you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to turn to 2 Samuel 13, and I'm not even going to put the text up on the screen today because I'm going to read through really a story or a series of events. And we're going to be looking at David. And here's the thing about David. David was a good king. In fact, I think David was a great king. But he was a very poor parent. In fact, his palace often resembled more of a Jerry Springer episode than it did really anything else. And I think all of this culminated with what to me would have to be the worst thing imaginable for a parent. His son Amnon became infatuated with his half-sister Tamar. And then Amnon, consumed with lust for Tamar, rapes Tamar. And then her full brother, Absalom, finds out about it, and then he kills Amnon. In 2 Samuel 13, starting in 28, we read, Absalom ordered his men, listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Have I not given you this order? Be strong and brave. So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. So Amnon then fled because he thought his father was going to retaliate. And so Absalom fled, and Absalom became estranged from his father. In chapter 14, verse 28, we read, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Then Absalom became very bitter and lashed out at David. And I almost wonder here before we read this text, if Absalom was waiting for his father to respond. Here, I did this terrible thing. I killed my brother. The king knows about this. My father knows about this. Why isn't he doing anything? Why did he allow this? We see this tremendous spirit of bitterness in his life, and he's crying out for his father to do something. We pick up the story in chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your spirit is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case would come to me, and I would see that he gets justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way towards all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice. So he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And Absalom's coup worked. This is how embittered he is against his father. He's trying to completely undermine his father and take his place. And it forced David to flee from the palace to save his life. In verse 14, we read, "Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, 'Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword.' And then when Absalom couldn't kill David, He humiliated him by sleeping with his harem in plain sight of everyone. 2 Samuel 16:22. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Absalom's recklessness finally got him killed, and no one grieved more than David. 2 Samuel 18:33. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he wept, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, for most of us to understand the grief that David felt for Absalom in this moment. Because it's not like he is grieving as a parent grieves for a child who may have been killed by accident. David feels responsible for Absalom's demise. That's why he's saying that it should have been him. And Absalom was strong, handsome, intelligent, and charismatic. He should have been the next great king over Israel. He had all the tools. He was the one everyone had kind of looked to and placed their hope in. But something went tragically wrong with Absalom in his life and in his heart. And David felt personally responsible. And I think this is a very crucial moment for David in his life. Because it's at this point when he begins to self-evaluate. And I believe that David realized that he made some tremendous mistakes in his life with his children. And I think these are mistakes that he corrected because his later children, his younger children, seemed to turn out very well. Because after all, this is where Solomon comes from. He raised Solomon. He mentored Solomon. And he did things with Solomon that he didn't do with the other children. And so I'd like for us to take a look at some of the mistakes that David made to encourage us as parents, not just fathers, but parents and grandparents and future parents, so that we don't fall into those same patterns, that we don't fall into those same mistakes, because it's very important. And David, I believe, again, came to that point of self-evaluation. He came to kind of that critical juncture where he said, I have to change the way that I'm doing this. I cannot make these mistakes anymore. You say, well, what kind of mistakes are you talking about? Well, for example, I think the first mistake that David would have admitted to is that he set a bad example, especially in the area of his sexual life. Now, we all know the story of David and Bathsheba, but it actually went far deeper than that. You see, David had many wives and concubines, and many of us may not know this because it was such common practice in the Old Testament, but this was a practice that God forbid. That this was not something that David was supposed to be doing, and I wonder if this did not create a certain tone in the palace, because this is what Dad is doing. And I wonder if it did not create kind of a sexually charged kind of environment, and the king or the kids are seeing what Dad is doing and these kinds of things that did not lead to Amnon looking at his sister the way that he did and causing Amnon to treat Tamar the way that he did, setting off this whole tragic course of events. Because the truth is that children pay attention to their parents. They watch, they listen, they emulate. I have a good friend in California that I kind of grew up with named Kenny, and Kenny's a car guy. And one day he's out in his car and he's working on the engine, and he's got to try and break a bolt loose that's way down in the engine. And if, guys, you know what I'm talking about. You know, that one that's hard to reach and you can barely get the wrench on it. And then when you try and break it loose, it just slips, and that's what was happening. And he would have to put all his strength onto this wrench, and it would slip, and he would hit his knuckles on the side of the motor. And Kenny would say, shoot, shoot, shoot. Except he wasn't saying shoot, shoot, shoot. And Kenny's 4-year-old son is also a car guy. And he's in the garage playing with his little car while his dad works on his car. And Kenny was trying to break that bolt loose, and he couldn't get it, and he actually got up to go get a glove or something to put over his hand because he was just tearing his hand up, and he looked over, and there's his 4-year-old banging his little car against the ground going, shoot, shoot, shoot. Except his 4-year-old wasn't saying shoot, shoot, shoot. Guys, our children watch and imitate what we do. And for some reason, they're really good at picking up on the negative things, even more so than the positive things. And they do pick up on the positive things, but for some reason, we latch on to the negative things even more. 1 Kings 22:52 reads, "He did evil in the eyes of the Lord because he walked in the ways of his father and mother." 2 Chronicles 22:3, "He too walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother encouraged him in doing wrong." Jeremiah 9:14, "They have followed the stubbornness of their hearts. They have followed the Baals as their fathers had taught them." Guys, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of verses like this in Scripture. And we see this too, the sins of the fathers kind of thing. And we see this in families, and it's real easy when you're distant from the family. You know what I'm talking about? Like when you're not in it. When you're in the family, I guess sometimes it's hard to see, but you meet someone sometimes, and maybe mom or dad has a certain personality issue going on, and it's so easy sometimes as an outsider to see those exact same issues that are going on with the children, and how we just pass those things on to our children. And so it's important for us to remember that our children pick up on so much more than we think. They listen to what we say. They watch what we do. They emulate our attitudes and our values and our behaviors. And this mantra of do what I say, not what I do, doesn't work. It's never worked, and it never will work. And I think that David learned that the hard way. And so David was a bad example. I think that likewise, not only was David a bad example, but he indulged his children, and he did not discipline his children. He offered very little in the ways of guidance and supervision and direction for his children. Parents are responsible to do that, to guide their children and raise their children in the way they should go. Consider this. Amnon, his son, rapes his sister. And David finds out about this, and he's very angry. But he doesn't do anything about it. And then his son Absalom kills his brother Amnon. And David doesn't do anything about it. And then Amnon is down at the city gates, and he's stealing the hearts of all the people. He's undermining his father's authority. He's undermining the entire kingdom, and his father doesn't do anything about it. And so his children are committing rape, murder, and treason, and David doesn't do anything about it. And it makes you wonder that if those are the things that they're getting away with, these big things, what else are all of the other children in the palace getting away with? And so the image here, the picture that's forming, is basically that all of his children from all of these different women are a bunch of spoiled rich kids running around doing whatever it is that they want and facing absolutely no consequences for their behaviors. I wonder if in some respects we don't have some of those similar problems today. You hear it all the time. Older generations. I guess in some regard, maybe this has always been true, because I remember, those old World War II vets complaining about my generation. But, the generations today, always complain about, the millennials and even Generation Z coming behind them and how entitled, they all are. And I think for a lot of the younger generations, for a lot of people in those generations, and especially in our community that's as affluent as we are, that maybe there is some truth to that. Because you see all the time, kids basically given anything they want, everything they want. Some of the kids are like, I don't live in that family. But other generations look at you and what you have and the cars you drive and, the toys you have. I mean, when I was a kid, all my toys fit in a cardboard box. And that was my toy box. And I was happy with that. That was awesome. I know kids today, all their toys do not fit in a room. They have a toy room, and they still do not fit, And so, the older generations are looking and saying, man, these kids are given everything and more than they could possibly want. And there are so many children in these younger generations, certainly not all, but there are many of the children who don't know what it's like to go without. They don't know what it's like to be told no. They don't know what it's like to have to necessarily work for something. And the social commentator Paul Harvey picked up on this, and he wrote a column to this effect. And I want to read you an excerpt from this column just because it's so good. And I think he understands how that can be a bad thing. Just, this overindulgence in giving the children everything. He writes, we tried so hard to make things better for our kids that we made them worse. For my grandchildren, I'd like better. I'd really like for them to know about hand-me-down clothes and homemade ice cream and leftover meatloaf sandwiches. I really would. I hope you learn humility by being humiliated, and that you learn honesty by being cheated. I hope you learn how to make your own bed and mow the lawn and wash the car. And I really hope nobody gives you a brand new car when you turn 16. It would be really good if at least one time you can see puppies being born and your old dog put to sleep. I hope you get a black eye fighting for something you believe in. I hope you share a room with your younger brother. And it's all right if you have to draw a line down the middle of the room, but when he wants to crawl under the covers with you because he's scared, I hope that you let him. I hope you have to walk to school uphill with your friends and that you live in a town where you can do it safely. On rainy days when you have to catch a ride, I hope you don't ask your driver to stop you 2 blocks away so you won't be seen riding with someone as uncool as your mom. If you want a slingshot, I hope your dad teaches you how to make one instead of buying one. I hope you learn to dig dirt and read books. When you learn to use computers, I hope you also learn to add and subtract in your head. I hope you get teased by your friends when you have your first crush on a girl. And when you talk back to your mother, I hope you learn what Ivory soap tastes like. May you skin your knee climbing a mountain, burn your hand on the stove, and stick your tongue on a frozen flagpole. I don't care if you try beer once, but I hope you don't like it. And if a friend offers you dope or a joint, I hope you realize he is not your friend. I hope you make time to sit on a porch with your grandpa and go fishing with your uncle. May you feel sorrow at a funeral and joy during the holidays. I hope your mother punishes you when you throw a baseball through your neighbor's window, and that she hugs you and kisses you at Christmas time when you give her a plaster mold of your hand. These things I wish for you: tough times and disappointment, hard work and happiness. To me, it's the only way to appreciate life. I think that Paul Harvey's right. There's some research that was done on millennials in the late 90s. And this was in the 90s. I think things are far beyond this today. But in the 90s, late 90s, when millennials were kind of cutting their teeth, there was $140 billion annually was spent by people under the age of 18. And that works out to $4,500 per teenager. Purchases by and for teenagers tripled in the 90s and continue to increase, and 11% of minors currently own stock. we give our children everything. And we ask very little in return as far as standards and behavior and accountability. And I wonder, what that does to their values and their ego and their worldview. And I think one good trend that I see is I do believe for sure, without question, that parents today are far more engaged and involved in the lives of their children than they were during my generation. And maybe that translates into a little more discipline, and it has to translate into some good things. I don't know about the discipline. I don't know if I see that. But I do know this, that if we overindulge our children in this age of rampant consumerism, that we run the risk of teaching them that life revolves around them and their needs and their desires. And if you ever get to the point where that sinks into your child, where your child, however old your child happens to be, whether he or she is 2 or 3 or 18, 19 or 30, if they get to that point where they believe that everything's about them and their needs and their desires, you are headed for trouble. I think that David would agree with you and that he would certainly affirm that, because I think that's one of the lessons that David learned about his parenting and his children. And so David realized that he wasn't a great example. He realized that he's indulging his children. I think another mistake that David realized he made is that he wasn't around very much. And I guess we can excuse David that, because he is the king. And he has a kingdom to run and wars to fight. And really he created a situation where he had more kids than he could possibly keep track of. And so it's impossible for him to spend quality time with more than just even 1 or 2 by this time in his life. But still, David's absence, physically and emotionally, it was obvious and had a profound impact on his children. Not only did his children not have supervision, because who's going to, correct the king's child, because they can just go running back to dad, is that they also had very little guidance in their lives. And left to themselves, children cannot raise themselves. There are things they cannot learn when you are physically or emotionally absent. I have a very good friend who left a very prestigious denominational post. He was kind of a shooting star in the Southern Baptist denomination, and destined to really be one of the greatest mission leaders of our generation, if not the greatest domestic mission leader that we have. And I've worked directly with him for several years, and in all my dealings with him, he was always extremely committed and conscientious. He worked long hours, spent a lot of time on the road, and was just always preoccupied with the important matters of the kingdom. And they are important matters. And then one day, he completely surprised everyone by just quitting. And he took a position as an associate pastor at his local church, which everyone saw as a complete downgrade for him. I mean, how can he move from this position of national prominence, and he's writing books, and he's headlining conferences, and he's doing all of these things, these wonderful things that everybody vocationally for their career in what he did, I mean, he was at the pinnacle. He had arrived, and just out of the blue, without any warning, he just steps down and everyone is shocked. And they're like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? We don't understand. Can you help me make sense of this? And he did it because he did not want to shortchange his family any longer, especially his son. And I know his son, he's a great guy. He's a sharp, good-looking, intelligent kid, and just very bright and inquisitive. And again, Dad just wasn't around in those high school years, and he began hanging around with the wrong crowd, and he began doing drugs, and by some miracle he graduated, because that was really in flux there. We didn't know if he was even going to graduate, and then when he did, he really didn't care and had no direction, no goals, nothing going on. And so my friend realizes this really kind of late, but still wants to do something about it. And so he quits this prestigious job where it was really the dream job for his career, so that he can be there for his son. And also for his younger daughter, because he had a son and a daughter, for his daughter who was just now entering into the 9th grade, was just entering into high school. And nobody really got it. They're like, well, can't you, can't you make this work some other way? We really need you. And he's like, no, I have to be home for my kids. And a mutual friend ran into his daughter like a month after he did this. And he asked her, he said, hey, how are things at home? And she just lit up and gave him this beaming smile. And she said, I got my dad back. Guys, you may think that, you have to make certain sacrifices, or certain sacrifices are worth it to justify the lifestyle. Or you may think that you can make up for your physical or emotional absence with money and toys and trips and all of those kinds of things. Or you may think that your physical presence is enough, or just enough. But I want to tell you, and I believe this is true in my own experience, and it's certainly true from David's experience, that if you don't do everything you can to be involved and engaged with your children on a regular, if not daily basis, your children are going to suffer. They're the ones that are going to pay the price. And I get it. I understand reality. Some of us have jobs that are so demanding, and that's what my friend realized. He couldn't do both. He couldn't be a father and have the career that he wanted, and he made a choice. I understand there's pressures out there. Here's the other thing about the pressures. The world is really good at screaming the hardest and the loudest and the longest, and our kids are really good at just kind of quietly going away into the corner. And so there's just so much pulling at us, especially in those middle years when we have kids and we're trying to grow our careers and we're trying to do those things to get ahead, and we're really trying to provide for our families. I mean, we're doing these things for our families so they can have things maybe that we didn't have. I understand it's complicated. And so I say this with all of that into consideration. At the end of the day, we have to determine what's most important. We have to determine where our true priorities lie. Because when we're done, when we hang it up for good, we're going to look back on our lives and we're going to have to ask ourselves the question, was it worth it? Was how we approached this, how we lived our lives, was it worth it? Was it worth it selling out everything else for our career? Or was it worth it selling everything out for our hobby? Or was it worth it selling everything out for the bottle or whatever personal sin we had? All those things that we kind of put in place. Or maybe over sometimes of those priorities that God would have us have in our lives. And in my position, in my role as pastor, I have the privilege of walking with people in some of those final hours of their lives. And I've heard people reflect in this way. And I've never heard anybody once talk about, man, I wish I'd have just spent more time in my career. I wish I'd have worked more overtime. I wish I'd have just poured more into that. You know what they're saying? man, I wish I'd have been a better father. Wish I'd have invested more in my kids. I wish I would have spent more time in those areas that I now realize are the most important. You know, I'm not sure there's anything you can do to guarantee that you're just going to have great kids that, you know, that follow God in every way and, you know, go out and, you know, set the world on fire and just do everything right. I mean, we all know that's not how life works. But there are some things we can do as parents, some impediments, some obstacles that we can place in the way of our children that's going to make it much more difficult for them to thrive and to really flourish in those ways. And David was a master at it. Setting a bad example, indulging his kids and not providing the guidance that he needed to show them, and then just basically being an absentee parent, just not being around. And you put those three things together, and that's a recipe for disaster. And so I want to challenge you today. I want to challenge the dads. You know, we talk about family, and we talk about, you know, our role and how important it is. I mean, this is like fatherhood 101 right here. You know, don't do these things. Do the opposite. Man, work to set that good example for your kids. And give them that guidance. You know, teach your kids. Take them under your wing and let them know when they mess up and discipline them when they mess up and point them in that right direction and then be there for them. Not just physically, but be there for them emotionally. Make every effort to be a part of their lives. And I understand, especially when they're teenagers, that they're going to roll their eyes and think that you're corny and all that kind of stuff. And you know what? That's okay. Because my kids are in their 20s now, and they used to do that stuff when they were teenagers, and now they're coming back and they're saying, yeah, we remember, and that was awesome. And we really appreciate that. So don't let that deter you. And not just the fathers. I think these are things mothers can learn from. Grandparents can learn from. You know, those of you who are teenagers and in the next decade or so, you know, you're going to fall in love and you're going to get married and you're going to have children. Man, resolve, this is the way that I'm going to do it. You know, every generation of parents always says, I'm going to do better by my kids. And I think this generation in many ways said, I'm going to give the kids the life that I never had. You know, I'm going to give them the things that I never had. I know that my generation was that way. I think that's kind of wrong, kind of the wrong place in the priority list. I mean, I guess that's important and all that, but I think what needs to be at the top is, you know what, I'm going to invest in my kids, and they're going to know they're loved. They're going to know that I care about them. They're going to know God loves them, and I'm going to do everything that I can to grow them up in God's way. And I'm going to set an example, and I'm going to guide them in that direction, and I'm going to be there for them as they walk this journey and as they walk this path.